Hey, it's Ryder, and I hope you're taking some time to try something new in life. The channel has seen a lot of support that continues to grow, and I wanted to extend a thank you to the entire community. I love reading through your comments, answering questions, and even learning how I can improve either my game knowledge or my video quality. Today's video will cover a list of mythics that I deem to be applicable to most builds, as long as considerations are made. I will not be including every item on the list, as not every mythic is worth using in PvP. We'll start with the most obvious choice, but offer some context as well. The Monomyth grants us 2 strong offensive buffs with a minor debuff while on the front bar, and 2 strong defensive buffs with a minor debuff on the back bar. A first glance may indicate that this set requires a trade-off of sorts, like taking 5% more damage while on the front bar, and slowly losing ultimate on the back bar, but those effects aren't even apparent. To begin with the case of minor vulnerability, this is one of the most common debuffs applied by one person to their opponent and comes from a plethora of sources naturally part of one's kit, such as stemming from the concussion status effect from shock damage, and even more consistently from the popular ability Elemental Susceptibility. Because we're more than likely to already have this debuff on us, the downside is redundant and doesn't actually provide any impact. The backbar debuff is a bit more interesting, however, as sources of minor timidity are scarce, and I wouldn't be surprised if most people are unfamiliar with this debuff. This is the foil to the heroism buffs, instead draining our ultimate while on the backbar. With sets such as Bloodspawn and traits such as Decisive, we can easily overcompensate for this deficit if our build happens to be better optimized in that direction anyway. If your build doesn't explicitly and naturally generate ultimate through passives, abilities, or sets, you'll probably notice a slight decrease to your ultimate gain when on the defensive. The Mythic pairs well with any sets and passives that offer high critical hit chance, and should be in any build aiming for the highest critical damage possible. Even for builds that don't optimally utilize the Major Force buff, the Major Protection buff while on the back bar frees up a space for those wanting stronger defensives. To explain its power, we must look at the paths to high damage, which are avenues builds use to achieve their win conditions. One could separate this into a few categories, such as critical hits and damage, penetration, spell damage, and debuffs. Many of the damaging skill lines include high amounts of critical damage and were balanced around the other 2 skill lines that the class came with. With subclassing, however, these considerations were dismissed, thus unlocking a floodgate of damage for players to exploit. For example, I'm a Templar main, and my Aegis Spear line provided me 12% critical damage, and my other 2 skill lines gave me a little bit of weapon damage and some healing as well. Now, however, I'm able to easily achieve much higher critical damage with Animal Companions and Assassination. So, to revisit our idea of paths to highest damage, the path that results in the fastest kills currently lies in critical damage, as class passives that offer penetration and weapon damage cannot compete with these values. In future patches, we might see critical damage from individual skill lines being reduced, but we'll have to wait and see. If these changes occur, and we see a decrease in either critical hit or critical damage, the effectiveness of the Monomyth would also diminish. As it currently stands, however, this remains one of the most powerful choices. Torc of the Ayleid King is the second item on this list, and I wanted to talk about the item sooner rather than later, as I want to encourage players to consider this option while we explore the Wild West that is subclassing. The item offers raw mitigation, damage output, and recovery while disabling your other sets. An important part of this description is what it does not say, which is Torc will account for your traits, weights, and enchantments, so don't just throw in any piece of gear to fill the slot. Most players shrug this off as non-ideal or simply boring, but the set carries a lot of strength in its versatility. Players like Kirchhoff utilize this build to great effectiveness in open-world environments where one must consider a variety of builds. One's immediate concern for this item would be the lack of critical resistance, as the stat is now more important than ever. But like anything in ESO, the problems and solutions of one scenario must also consider the larger context, and in this case, survivability within the crit damage meta. Currently, the best sources of defensive prowess come from critical mitigation and either blocking or dodging, both maneuverability options that provide large amounts of damage reduction. By simply blocking a devastating ability like Nightblade's Bow Proc or Incapacitating Strike, we can reduce well over 50% of the damage before other defensive buffs like Major Protection, and in this case, sets like Torc that offer raw damage reduction as well. If you compare this to Rallying Cry, a set that gives us 24% critical resistance, we're receiving 9% less damage reduction against critical hits, but we're also opening this build to be more general. The value of the Torc is exemplified from this, as the item is entirely consistent in all regards. The other strength of this item lies within its unappreciated accessibility. The list of possible combinations of skills can be overwhelming, even to veteran players, so Torc also offers a more predictable environment that eliminates a lot of the variables that go into a build. Even if this item isn't part of the final product of your setup, keep this as a tool that helps you focus on just your skill selection. Oakensoul is another item historically viewed as an accessibility option, and while this is true, players don't often use it this way. Players like Zito Burrito use this item to achieve highly specialized builds that achieve a very specific goal, such as building and using ultimate as quickly as possible. Builds that have a set rotation of 1 through 4 abilities that require constant upkeep to meet a condition should use this item. I've seen this used in heavy attack builds, both with dual wielding and lightning staves, so with subclassing, don't dismiss this as just an accessibility option, but rather a way of keeping up and carving out a specific niche. If you're someone who can envision yourself with a small quantity of abilities to create a combination, or just like to keep up less abilities, Oakensoul could be a good addition. Generalist builds should avoid this, as while buffs like Major Resolve are provided, you're missing out on many secondary effects of the Resolve buffs, as covered in my theory crafting video. You'd also be missing weapon enchantments from your back bar, and in most cases a monster set as well. If you choose this ring, your attention to detail must be quite precise to make it more optimized. Malacath is a mythic you should use if you're utilizing proc sets that cannot benefit from critical strikes and abilities, and skill lines that offer raw damage input instead of critical chance or damage, like Storm Calling. Players have used this in the past, only on dot builds, but this isn't the end of its use. Your opponent will more than likely be in Rallying Cry, which gives an additional 24% critical damage reduction on top of the standard allotment of traits and CP that provide an additional 27% reduction, totaling just over 50% reduced incoming critical damage. If our build has a 50% critical chance and 120% critical damage, we're essentially saying that we have a 50% chance to deal 70% more damage, or on average, are dealing 35% more damage per hit. Now, this isn't necessarily transferable to the real world, as damage isn't measured in per second, but per window of opportunity, though a comparison of an average damage increase of a normal critical hit versus Malacath's 16% damage increase, you can more easily evaluate if this mythic would benefit or hinder you. For builds choosing not to score critical hits or use sets that cannot benefit from a critical hit, Malacath's could be a strong option and can counter the meta, but this would require your build to be specialized. For Sea-Serpent's Coil, unfortunately, it is a mythic that is subjected to direct comparison to the Monomyth in 2 ways. To begin, both offer high amounts of damage increase and, to a degree, survivability in the form of either spell damage or major protection. The viability of the mythic, unfortunately, greatly diminishes outside of a dueling environment, as positioning is the best tool to survive. Ranged builds can make better use out of this item, and in the case of a build going further into raw damage increases rather than critical damage, they may still benefit greatly from this. Satan's Seducer is a melee-oriented necklace item that is akin to how Daedric Trickery operates. As it activates, there's an AoE effect around you that changes color to match the effect. As I am colorblind, I cannot inform you on which color corresponds to which buffs and debuffs, but memorizing these colors or reading a buff tracker can allow you to time the burst with the set, allowing for your combo to land a lot harder. This, as I mentioned, requires some attention to fully optimized, but isn't required to attain much of the item's value. I would categorize this as a mythic to run if you're unsure of the direction to take with your build, but you know it's melee oriented, and cannot provide the buffs and debuffs listed on the set. When making this choice, ignore the resolve line in the text and treat it as a period where your set is not active. While running this, I thought I'd be a lot more impacted by this dead period, but with how frequent all of the other effect combinations are, I rarely notice the resolve line active. Cryptcanon is a niche set, but is put on this list for its potential in group play. Because the meta is centered around higher bursts in shorter windows, groups should coordinate their ultimates to time and deliver together to ensure a target is knocked out. There are many cases, however, where two teams of strong players can line up their skills perfectly, but the HP bars barely move. While I mentioned Geral's being one alternative to outpace cross-healing, Cryptcanon operates closer to mechanical acuity, but grants the effect to your team. A player utilizing skill trees like Siphoning and Winter's Embrace to generate ultimate quickly, as well as Bloodspawn and Arcasis, can reach 500 ultimate in record times. If you're paired with player or players using Balorg, an expensive ultimate like Eye of the Storm or Northern Storm, your team can pull off back-to-back ultimate dumps, which will kill off almost anyone. Making the most out of this set requires coordination, and I recommend being in a Discord call while running open world with this item. If you become impatient with this item, it can lose its effectiveness almost immediately, and may take a while for you to build up ult for a bursting combo with your friend, during which your opponent may have several opportunities to reach their win condition. Death Dealers was an item run by sorcerers and other builds that made use out of maximum stat lines. The item scales really well with skills such as Inner Light or Bound Armaments that offer a % increase on maximum resources. At its full potential, the set adds just around 2600 of each resource, which can be equated to 26 additional attribute points per stat. The effectiveness of this mythic is dependent on the environment. The item is least potent in duels, as fights usually have much shorter times in combat, but in places such as Imperial City, Battlegrounds, or Cyrodiil, your character is often locked into combat when any ally attacks or is attacked, activating the effect well before you actually enter the fight. If your build aims for maximum resources, this item fills a similar spot as Torc of the Ayleid King, in that it provides versatility and raw stat increases rather than providing a certain condition. Markyn is an item used as an alternative to Death Dealer's Fete. In many ways, it fills the same slot, but offers a different set of stats instead. There's not too much to discuss with the item other than it offers general stat increases that scale with other buffs like Major Sorcery, but this is often an item I used as a first draft of a build, but usually gets pushed out when I have more of a solid idea of what I'll be running. I was never feeling the effects of the ring other than a general increase to survivability and damage, but again, when faced with an opportunity cost, you must evaluate if this ring is worth the slot. If your build is on an extreme end of any spectrum, such as high damage versus low damage, or high burst versus dots, I would avoid this item. If, however, your build is going for a true middle ground of damage versus survivability and you still desire set effects, use this item rather than Torc of the Ayleid King. Lefthander can be useful in Cyrodiil fights with undodgeable effects such as ground AoEs and dots. Outside of this case, however, I can't see an optimized use for this where this mythic is preferred to one of the previous options. This item is a prime example of an option suffering through comparison to others of the same slot, as it doesn't provide enough bonuses to keep up with other options. If you haven't kept up with recent small updates within the patch, Pearls was nerfed heavily, and in fact considered dead by PV ears. Previously, the item offered an unnamed gain of ultimate, but has been since nerfed to major heroism. On paper, the ultimate gain should remain the same, but in practice this isn't the case. ESO has problems of inconsistent ticking when any amount of latency is added, so the activation proc from this item loses value as performance degrades. Even without much packet loss, however, the item no longer scales with major heroism, as it provides the same buff for you, but on a shorter window than skills such as Trample or Shimmering Shield. If the nerfs to this item didn't exist, there would be a lot more discussion and synergy pairings, but as of the video's release, this item does not have a place in the meta. Gaze of Sithis was more effective in previous patches where raw mitigation was more desirable, but that isn't to say it's completely useless now. Builds that benefit from high armor values, such as those utilizing the cutting defense CP, or just generally bash builds, benefit from that really high armor and health added from this item. The downsides for this item are apparent, however, removing the ability to use a monster set, cutting out a lot of ultimate interaction in the form of Bloodspawn or Balorg, but also prevents the user from benefiting from blocking. This lack of synergy would encourage a player to roll dodge more, but given this as a heavy item, this discourages the playstyle as heavy armor increases your cost of roll dodging. Despite this, if you're keen on running an arena weapon but are worried about breaking away from the typical meta setup, as discussed in the theory crafting video, this set justifies the choice of any arena weapon, either front bar or back bar. In short, Gaze of Sithis could be used if a build was tailored for it, but the lack of blocking allows skills like Merciless Resolve or Deep Fissure to hit exceptionally hard. If we enter a patch where higher mitigations are more valuable than critical strikes, then the item could return to a higher spot on the list of viable options. For Rakkhat's Voidmantle, I've not done any testing on the new heavy attack Mythic in PvP, though I can see some potential cases for this. For those unaware, light attacks make up about 20% of damage done in a fight, with obvious margins of variability dependent on player and build. Anyone using a typical setup will be light attacking between each ability, with obvious pauses for block casting, block weaving, and roll dodging. The set would give an advantage of 30% more damage than a light attack, but at the cost of not performing any abilities. Builds utilizing heavy attacks, such as Sergeant's Mail, can greatly improve the impact of their heavy attacks, though the issue of being vulnerable and predictable while heavy attacking remains the same, and in fact worsens as you're pushed to continue this attack more often. In cases where you don't expect to be targeted, like channeling a lightning staff heavy attack while you stand behind your group or on top of a wall, this is where the Voidmantle would shine the most. Given that you'd have to rely on your enemies not hitting you in order to yield the most from this item, however, I don't expect to see this ran within many high-performing builds. If you're looking to get into PvP or know someone who might struggle with keeping up with various attack options, however, this is by no means a terrible item and can definitely allow some players to enjoy their time at Battlegrounds. If you find the set to be more useful than I mentioned, please let me know. And with that, we'll close out the video. There are, of course, other mythics in the game, though I didn't want to discuss why the others are not viable. Items like Snow Treaders and Wild Hunt absolutely have their use, though items outside the ones listed would already be considered by practice theory crafters who wouldn't need to listen to me discuss those items. If you have any suggestions on content you would like to see, please let me know, as I want to provide answers to questions that members of the community might have. As always, I hope the rest of your day is peaceful, and remember to step outside your comfort zone.